And we are back. Our next speaker will be Marjorie Figueroa, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, who will tell us about accessibility, what, why, and how. So let's welcome Marjorie. So Marjorie is a front-end developer from Venezuela, currently living and working in Germany. She's passionate about accessibility and loves all things JavaScript and CSS, hoping to make web a better and more accessible for everyone. In her free time, you can find her playing board games, video games, or reading. Hello, Marjorie. How is it going?
Hi, all good. And you?
Yeah, thank you. Very nice. I was really enjoying the first talk by Manfred and looking forward to the following content. So what about those games? Can you give us some tips? Because this year was a bit special in terms of the allocation of free times. So maybe you can give us some cool tips for games we could enjoy for the last couple of months.
I mean, I'm very obsessed with board games. They're actually at the moment supporting my laptop, so I can stand. And yeah, I'm very into strategic kind of games, like Game of Thrones and this kind of things.
Sounds good. Okay. So without further ado, let's hop into the talk. Please, everybody, enjoy the Marjorie's talk.
Cool. So hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everyone to having me. This link that you see here is the link to the slides in case that you want to follow along. And yeah, so let's start. And here we have my talk, which is about accessibility, what, why, and how. But before starting to talk about accessibility and all this, I would like to take a moment to talk about disabilities. And what are disabilities? This word is very hard to find a definition for. In general, disabilities is an umbrella term, meaning that an umbrella term is a word or a phrase that covers a wide range of concepts. For example, birds. Birds includes all different types of birds, hummingbirds, parrots, penguins, etc. And the problem with this kind of terms is on the way that our brain works. We tend to abstract and generalize depending on our experiences, and this might not be such a problem when we talk about animals or things. When we start talking about people, social topics, genders, or rights, it can get very problematic. And this is, I believe, what happens with the word disabilities. When I say this word, each of us might think about something different, but many of us also think about the same thing. Which could be someone in a wheelchair, a blind person. It will depend, because the interpretation of the word will be different from person to person. And that is why establishing one definition for this is so problematic. If we go to the dictionary, it tells us that a disability is an illness, injury, or condition that makes it difficult for someone to do the things that other people do. But what are these things that other people do? This definition relies on the interpretation of a normal activity. Something that is considered normal in one culture or society might not be in another. And as we can see, it also tends to be associated with a health issue only, when in reality it's much more than that. The World Health Organization says that disabilities can include impairments, which are problems in a person's body function or structure, participation restrictions, which is more of the involvement on life situations, and activity limitations, which is a difficulty encountered when executing an activity or an action. We can also see disabilities as a mismatch between a person's abilities and their environment, meaning inaccessible environments create disabilities. And this is where the concept of accessibility comes into place. The what? What is accessibility? If we go again back to the basics, it is the ability to access. But the principle of accessibility is to eliminate or reduce barriers that hinder the rights of people with disabilities. And this does not matter if it's about spaces, things, information, anything. In the context of the web, paraphrasing from Kate Cunningham Accessibility Handbook, and it has to do a bit more with what universal design is. And as we can see, accessibility is directly connected to disability. So the way that we interpret this word will affect the way that we consider accessibility in our things, because many people do not think that it's necessary, or we get this argument that we do not have enough users with disabilities on our website, when this is completely untrue. So why do we have to do it? for what I say. We might have an idea, you might already have an idea, but if you ask me, I say because it's the right thing to do. And sadly, this is not enough for many. If it will be, I wouldn't be here talking to you and our world would be completely different. But to kind of understand a bit better why is this happening and why there's such lack of accessibility implementations on the web, I think we have to go a bit back. The thing is that the world that we live in is in a state of constant change. We can say that the only constant is change. We went from having these super giant computers that fit in a whole room to being able to wear them in our wrist. We went from having websites that look like this, just text and some links, nothing else, to having websites that looks like this. A bunch of cookies, consent banners, pop-ups, animations, a bunch of different things. And technology has changed. The web evolved. And by now, the web is part of our everyday life. If we apply for a job, trying to do our taxes, learning new things, online shopping, even now in this current situation that we're going through, the web has become even more and more important for a lot of people. And I believe that we successfully managed to increase the reach of technology, the internet, but we also successfully managed to make it confusing, inaccessible, and not so welcoming for everyone. In 2019, the Web Accessibility in Mind, which is a nonprofit organization, has provided accessibility solutions since 1999. They conducted an accessibility evaluation of the homepage for the top 1 million websites. And they use a tool called WAVE. This tool detects patterns in a web page content that align with the end user accessibility issues and the web content accessibility standards. So there are all of these standards, and this tool will compare what is in the site against all of these things. The problem with these tools is that they're limited in the detection of the issues. Only around 25% of possible issues can be automatically detectable. And this is what makes this number very, very bad. So this was the amount of errors that it found, more than 59 million, almost 60 million. This is an average of 59.6 errors per page. And what does it tell us? Tell us that 97.8% of the analyzed websites contain errors. And these are sites like Instagram, Facebook, Washington Post, Forbes, Reuters, Stanford, Berkeley, University, and more. So there are news sites, social media sites, university sites, and this is very, very problematic. And why is this happening, right? Well, as I say that we tend to experience and to change the way that we think about things depending on our experiences. We also mirror these experiences into the things that we create. We have this image of how computers should be used or how to navigate on the web. We have 2 hands to use the keyboard and the mouse. We have eyes that are capable to distinguish all of the details. We do not have any pain, and there's nothing in our environment that can interrupt us. Does it sound real? No, because it isn't. But for some reason, most of what we do is oriented to this perfect image of a user. The thing is that we all will experience disability at some point in our lives. Later on, we're all getting all our bodies deteriorate. And we also experience life in different ways. So we cannot assume that everyone will experience the web in the same way that we do. Some people have difficulty to see certain colors. Others have difficulties using their hands or have pains that prevent them from using a mouse for a long time or at all. Parents, for example, have only one hand most of the time while carrying their children. And like these, there are millions and millions of examples of how we interact with the web and our environment in different ways. And even then, after all this, accessibility is often forgotten or disregarded. We leave it for last. We wait for someone to complain, or even worse, we don't care. And this is what I think is very important. Like, it tends to be left, as I say, for the end. We wait for that user to say, hey, I cannot use your website, it's causing me troubles. So we wait for someone to be bothered by it. When in reality, it's our job to have this ready and to implement this along on every step of the way. But then how? How can we do this? In my opinion, we all have a role to play regarding accessibility, whether you're a designer, a developer, a tester, a business person, everything or something completely different, you have something to contribute. So I wanted to go through some of the topics that cause a lot of errors and that are found out there and see who are we helping when doing this. So my first advice for everyone is go back to the basics. Every day we have so many things coming up, new frameworks, new technologies, new shiny things to play with, that we tend to forget the basics. And also, I believe it's never bad to go back and refresh the knowledge that we tend to give by granted, and maybe we discover things that we didn't know. So one of my first points is having a semantic and a structured HTML. And with this, I mostly mean to use the right tag in the right place. So HTML provides us with all of these different tags, headlines, articles, asides, buttons, etc. Regardless of the framework that you use, everything will be translated to HTML. So we need to know how to use it properly. And all of these tags have their own meaning and their native behavior. We have some assistive technologies that use what is called the accessibility tree, where the browser takes the DOM and modifies it into a form that is useful for these technologies. And this might have less information, maybe less notes because some elements are only visual, but we can say that the accessibility tree is a subset of the DOM tree. And this can be done because the DOM has a semantic meaning. It uses HTML, and native HTML elements work well because they have their behavior established. It is predictable. And when using, for example, an anchor tag, we know that is a link. So when we write our HTML, we should make sure that we're using what is provided, because in many cases, it is enough. So let's see this very classic example of a div versus a button. So when we try to make a button using a div, and we inspect this element, we can see that the browser knows nothing about it. There's no role, it's generic, there's no text on it, because it has no way of knowing what this is. And as the browser doesn't know, someone that uses a screen reader won't also know what's happening with this element. And it might not be reachable if we didn't apply or configure it properly. So when you use a button, then the browser knows. It knows that it's focusable, it knows that it's a button, it knows the content that is in there, and it can communicate all of this to the user. So in general, it's our job to choose the proper tags. And if you're creating a state-of-the-art element where no other tag will fit, then do so. But you need to keep in mind that you need to make sure it's accessible and provide the right roles and behavior for it. We need to make sure that it's reachable with the keyboard, that the browser knows what it is and what it's doing, maybe using ARIA roles if it's necessary or not, and so on. In the part of the structured HTML, we talk more about how the code is written, because the reading and navigation order is determined by the order of the code. And this one should be logical and intuitive. For example, headings form a great part of how to structure our site. And in this analysis that they did, they found that skip headings were present in more than 36% of all the pages. And how should we do this? Well, basically, H1 describes the website and should be similar to the title. And we should always have only one H1, not anymore. And the rest, H2 to H6, will represent the are very important, because a lot of users, for a lot of people, this is the entry point to our page. So many people that use screen readers report to use headings as the way to get an idea of what's happening of the page. So there's some menus and some possibilities where you can bring all the headings of the page, and for there they navigate. So when we skip them or when we don't use them, it's very hard for someone to locate the content on the site. In the case of the tab index, this is an attribute that should be used very careful, because it can be very helpful or it can be kind of a disaster. So in here we have three possible options. We can put a number that is 1 or bigger than 1, and this will define a specific order. And most of the time it's a bad idea, because it will alter the natural order of the site, meaning that it will bring elements in focus before others, even if they're before. And if we put 0, this will allow elements to receive keyword focus. This doesn't change the order that they're placed with, but it adds it to the whole order of the navigation. But we also need to make sure that if we use this, we provide the correct behavior. For example, that the space and the enter key also do the work. And in the case that we use a negative number, -1, this will allow elements to receive focus via script, but not the keyword. This is mostly used when we want to focus like menu through a click or through an action that an user did. In general, we can say that an element with any value more or equal than 1 for the tab index will receive focus before any other element that doesn't have it or whose attribute its value is 0. In the case of order of elements, we can change sometimes the visual order of the element with CSS, for example, but their position in the code won't change, meaning we have this whole order determined by the code order, and then we alter this visually with CSS. And this could be kind of confusing for some people because some use a screen reader as a support and not as the main tool. So they will be using a screen reader and still looking at the site, and they will hear and see completely different things. So we need to be careful how to handle these kind of things. And who are we helping when we have a semantic and structured HTML? Then, as I mentioned, everyone that uses assistive technologies like screen readers. The next point is alternative text, which might sound very, very basic, but it's kind of tricky to know what to put in there. In this evaluation, there were more than 36 million images, and 33% of all images had this attribute missing, the text. Other 16 didn't have the attribute at all, and the other 16 had like very questionable text or very repetitive because some people use this attribute to do some SEO things, which is not really recommended. And writing an alternative text is not very straightforward. We need to take care of certain things. We need to provide the right context while still describing the image. So for example, in this, we have an image, and we can say it's a brown dog reading. That will depend where this image is placed. If the image is decorative and is not bringing any information to the content, then we don't need any text on the attribute, but the attribute still needs to be there. So we can say that all images need an alt attribute, but some of them might not need any text. And when writing the text, we need to be very careful of providing the right context where the image is. Another important point is focus. Focus will determine where the keyword events go in the page at any given moment. And some elements are focusable by default, like inputs or buttons, but others are not, like divs or spans. A rule of thumb will be if it's interactive, it needs a focus state. Here we have an image with 3 different inputs for 3 different browsers, and this is how it looks more or less. I guess it varies depending on where you use it, but it mostly comes up as a blue outline around the element. And this outline we tend to remove because it's ugly, or it doesn't go with our design, or we just don't like it. But to remove this outline causes that this element is still focusable, but there's no visible indication for keyword users, meaning they won't know where they are at the moment. And also sometimes leaving it up to the browser is not really enough because it will depend on the background color, the contrast, etc. So a CSS gives us the power to remove it, which we shouldn't. Also give us the power to change it. And we can use this for properties, outline color, style, width, and offset in order to configure it properly and to give it a style that goes better with our designs, and we don't need to remove it. So in this case, we're making it like red, dashed, and giving a 2 pixels offset, which means the spacing between this line are the border. And as I mentioned, color and contrast also plays like a big role in this whole accessibility thing, because when building products with diversity in mind, color choice is very important. The color can convey your brand identity, help users understand information, and not everyone perceives color in the same way. Users, including users with visual disabilities, must be able to perceive the content on the page very clearly. In the case of contrast, when we talk about contrast, we mean more the difference between the foreground and the background, the difference of these 2 colors. So we have a couple of examples to show up this. So we have here an image with all the color spectrum. And when we apply a filter that is simulating tritanopia, that consists on the lack of sensitivity to the color blue, we can see that the image looks completely different. So we can see mostly reds and kind of a teal color. And when we apply a filter for the lack of sensitivity to the color red, we now see that the image is mostly yellow and blue. So this is a problem because in many cases we try to convey information through color, for example, in a graph, and this information can be lost for someone that cannot perceive these colors properly. A good example of how it's done correctly is the colorblind friendly mode that Trello has. This adds a simple texture overlay to the color labels wherever they're shown. And the label keeps the color and the textures are added on top. So this will help any user that has problems looking at colors or distinguishing colors, that they can recognize the labels by patterns. This is a very important topic to keep in mind. In the case of the contrast, here we have the New York Times site and has some images and some text on it. And when we apply a filter simulating how people with low contrast sensitivity will see this, which is very common in older people, we can see that it's very hard to read. The text is not really as visible as before. And if this image will be full of text, it will be kind of hard to read. So also content will work different depending on the condition of the lighting. If we have sunlight or glare, it might vary how we see it. So your content should be easier to read by everyone, including those who do not have a specific visual condition. This is more about the contrast of the colors. So there are a lot of tools out there that help you measure the contrast between two colors. And in this particular one, it's Colorable. At the end of the last slide, I have a link with a bunch of resources that you can check out. And this tool is in there. But what it does is just checks the contrast between two colors. And in the top one here, we have like a greenish with a very deep purple. And it has a high contrast. It's passing the AAA standard, which is the highest one. And on the bottom part, we have like a more light purple with yellowish text. And this one will completely fail, meaning that you should not use this color combination for the text on your website if your background is this color or vice versa. So who are we helping by doing all of this? Basically, users with partial sight, which often experience limited color vision, older users that might not be able to see color well, or someone using a text-only or limited color or monochrome displays also might be unable to access a color-dependent information, and many other people. Talking about text, text is also out there in almost every page that we can see. And the thing with text is that not everyone reads at the same level or has the ability to understand the text content, even when we present it clearly and simple. There are reading disorders, memory disorders, attention deficit disorders, and other conditions which affect the brain cognitive processes and that can compromise a person's ability to benefit from text. And how do we kind of fix this or keep it in mind? Well, we should always use a simple language, meaning put information in logical order with important details first, and try to fit our language to the audience and context, providing definitions for unusual words or abbreviations, and try to be as literal as possible. Some people with cognitive disabilities have a very hard time distinguishing between the literal meaning of things and the implied meaning. Things like sarcasm or parody can be especially confusing for some people. And in the case of the fonts, choosing the right font is very crucial. Recommended is to use sans serif fonts that are the ones that don't have the little twirls on the ends, as they tend to be easier to read on screens, and try to be small fonts because that's very hard to read for everyone. When the user, for example, resizes the text up to 400%, which can happen, or changes the spacing of the text to be able to read it better, no information should be lost. So these are little things that we need to kind of test when developing our sites. And when using an icon font, we need to be very careful too, because some users have their own custom fonts that replace ours, and the icons will disappear. and then things might get lost. Other very common thing out there is media. And with media, I mean things like videos or podcasts, audios, etc. If we have audios or videos in our site, then ideally we should provide captions and transcriptions. This can be especially useful for someone with hearing difficulties, but also help people that prefer reading information as they can read along while listening at the same time. It's very common nowadays to find social media or basically anywhere videos that outplay ads or any other content, and this can be very bothersome for some people. There are people that have cognitive disorders that can get distracted by these videos and get distracted from the main content, or may cause a migraine. For someone with photosensitive epilepsy, it can increase the risk of a seizure or even cause one, for example, in pages that have a lot of GIFs or random GIF and things like this. And for someone using a screen reader, it can be almost impossible to listen to the content of the site when there are all of these videos playing also at the same time, because they will listen to the videos, the voice of the screen reader will be kind of mixed in between, so trying to pause it or to do anything at all can be very overwhelming. So at the end, I believe the user should always have the option to disable this kind of dynamic content. We should provide an option to disable animations or to stop videos, having them stop, and gives the option to the user to play them or not. And at the end, the most that we can do is test as much as we can. And how can we do this? Well, we can start by listening to our website. In Mac, you have VoiceOver, which is a screen reader. In Windows, you can download JAWS, or you can use, if you use Chrome, you can use Chrome Voice, which is also a screen reader for the browser, and run it through your website. Listen to what it's saying. See if you can understand what's happening. It might be very confusing at the beginning. It was for me, still is sometimes, but a lot of people that are using screen readers are self-taught, meaning that they are thrown in the web with a screen reader trying to figure out what's happening. And when we do not pay attention to how implement things properly, we are making all of the experience even worse for them. Another thing that we can do is forget about our mouse. Disconnect it, disable your trackpad, your mousepad, and try to navigate the website with only your keyboard. Can you do it? Can you access everything that you can access with the mouse, also with the keyboard, and do all of the actions? If yes, then great. If not, there's something that needs to be fixed. At the end, we can do automatic testing. There's tools like Lighthouse, Axe Coconut that will check our site. There are linters, there are unit testing tools, and they're great. They help a lot, but they're not enough. As I mentioned, not all automated tools can detect all of the problems, so we always need manual testing. And at the end, after all this, who is benefiting? Who benefits from accessibility? Well, I say everyone. If we break down our paragraphs, for example, and avoid clutter on our text, we're helping someone with dyslexia. If we fix those mouse-only interactions, we are helping someone that has motor impairments or someone with chronic pain or Parkinson that cannot actually use the mouse. If we stop autoplaying videos, we're helping people with cognitive disorders or ADHD. So as this, there are many, many other examples. And as you can see, small changes have a very big impact. I'm not coming here to say, oh, let's just throw away our whole website because it's not accessible. What I'm saying is that all of the things that we see, some things are things that we give by granted, that we think are not so important because they're so small. And as we can see, they're out there in many, many, many places and websites. So doing these small things are kind of a way to start to moving into the bigger ones. I don't want to go into bigger topics because I can stay here for like 3 hours and explain you different things, but this is like a base, a good base where you can start and say, okay, I'm trying to fix this, and then from there, move up to the bigger and bigger problems. And my last advice for everyone is, let's get out of our boxes. and start seeing the world for a different perspective. Let's diversify our team. Let's test with actual people. Let's try to experience things from other points of view and bring all of this into what we create. Because if each of us start changing things slowly and starts including accessibility on every step of the way, from conception to execution, and checking it as the product evolves, I'm sure that we can make the web a more accessible and inclusive place where everyone is welcome. And that's it. Thank you very much. This is the link for the repository with the resources, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Marjorie, for a very interesting talk. We have a couple of questions already actually in the chat, so let's start with answering them. First question was by Simon, who is asking about like the automated test for checking accessibility. So I mean, you mentioned like we could use like the screen readers as like one of the things like to start with, but maybe you can give us like some recommendation like for like some automated tools like for some other things, like as you mentioned, like in the semantic HTML and stuff like this. Maybe also like for like Angular specific, or it's just like general like for the front end in general.
Yeah, so you have like for unit testing, there's Jest that you can, Jest Ali, that you can install and start writing unit tests for accessibility. There's Axe Coconut that also is an extension in Chrome that checks automatically, but it has a whole library that you can use to develop your own test and test directly with accessibility. And you can integrate this into your whole pipeline and having automatically to break if something changes and it breaks the test.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question from Jan, which is like, are there ways to figure out if the user is using a screen reader? I mean, don't auto start ads isn't like utopia to do for all users, but to disable them for screen reader like would be a great way to start.
Yeah, so sadly, there's actually, it's very hard topic, right? Because a lot of people do not want to disclose their disability, as there's also a lot of taboo behind it, and they might seem as less. So asking someone, are you using a screen reader, is kind of a delicate topic. A lot of people are very up for and like upfront with it, but some might feel like they do not actually want to disclose it. So there's not actually a way to check, oh, this user has a screen reader, I will do this for them, because it's also kind of a privacy thing.
Yeah, because this goes like kind of in line with what you mentioned. Like there are often like people who are like it's not just like the font size or like the contrast, but also like these bigger issues when you can like trigger like some seizure or something, like to kind of have a heads up, even though, as you said, like it's best to like not do it at all. And that maybe comes like to another question of like the best practices, like because with all these things you mentioned, it's like extreme, like a lot of things you have to cover. So and then like there's like usually like multiple approaches to this. So something could like really try to cover everything of those things. And sometimes like you could see like in some games that like they provide like some modes. So it's like for the colorblind mode, or like for this kind of mode or that kind of mode. Like, are there like some guidelines or best practices on that?
Well, you always have the accessibility standards that you can check, and there are different levels. You can say I can conform to the A level, double A, or triple A. For example, in United States is everyone should conform to the double A because it's a law and you can get sued if you don't do it and you work with customers. But in general, I say always start slow. Like try solve these little things that are kind of easy to solve, like adding an alternative attribute in your images is not really so hard, and then slowly scale up to the bigger problems of maybe changing the structure of your HTML or making sure that the things are available for screen readers and all of these things. So it's always like a progressive enhancement kind of thing.
I see. At one point of your talk, you mentioned that there is like only like 25% of issues can be like detected like automatically. So is it something which like there is like some roadmap or like some possible improvements, or it's just like very hard thing to solve? Maybe like artificial intelligence can help with these kind of things, or because when we have like a tooling, we can deliver better things if it's automated, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's kind of with the technologies that we have, I think there's a lot of research on how AI can help this to figure out things, because there are things that are not really detectable by tools. Like, I mean, if you click on this, on that, and if that makes sense, because it's something that's more of a human kind of interaction. But I believe that in the future should be more, it should be better. At least I hope so. For now, there are a lot of people that specialize on this. So if it's possible or if it's in the budget, I will always suggest to hire an accessibility expert that can check your sites.
Speaking about like accessibility experts, like to get more of them in the future, could you recommend like some like learning materials or like where is like the best place like or like a resource which you use like when learning about these things, like for people who would like to dive deeper into this topic?
Yeah, so I put this link for the repo that I have. It's like bit.ly ali links. And there's a bunch of articles that you can read to maybe start and have an idea. You can go through the standards. They are kind of a bit boring to read because the format is kind of just plain, but they
Very
are,
accessible.
yeah, they're very useful. And this is like a book kind of,
Yeah.
if printed, is kind of like a book, but it's kind of interesting on all the different points that they explain. And yeah.
I see. So, and you mentioned like there is like there will be like a link to your repository with the links to those other resources, right?
Yeah.
And does this repository also contain links to like those like tools which you could be used for automated testing? Because that was like another question from the chat from Simon. So I guess then this all will be like shared like after the conference concludes. Like there will be like I think like some emails sent to all the participants which they can check the talks and all the resources. I think, or maybe even now. So
Sure.
cool that we have. What else do we have? Do we have some other questions in the chat? Silvana was just happy about one of those questions that it was also her question, so that's great to hear. And what do we have else? Oh yeah, maybe like one thing about those things, like when you were speaking about like the styling of the focus. So like I know like in practice also like when I work on some projects, like we usually like try to then use like just like CSS like with the border properties like around the border. So we still like put it like some width and color and something like this. But I was not aware that there are actually those dedicated like outline properties which can also specify the width and the style and something like this. Does this have any like impact like in terms of like a browser how it's handled, or you can still like just style like the standard like borders of those buttons? Does this make a difference?
So these are two different things. You can style the border and style the outline. They're completely independent. So I would say I always like to like use the offset property because kind of separates it from the border and avoids that they merge. In the case that they're different colors or the same color, it might not be even noticeable. So these kind of things really help to have it like a bit outside of the element, so it can be clear that it's an outline and that this element is focused. But it can be used regardless, either or.
I see. So I can imagine like exactly the situation when it can be like the color thing. And if you have like, as you said, like this offset, then like something new appears, doesn't only change the color. So it may be easier to notice. So
Yeah.
I guess that could be like a big advantage of this kind of approach. Okay, so I think we don't have more questions and we have like, yeah, then still some time like for this. So if there is anything more, feel free. And if not, then I guess we'll thank you again for your very interesting talk. And I hope it like inspired many people to look into this topic much more, because it's something which is unfortunately, as you said, like not taken like so often to the place where it should be taken. So I think that's very good to like raise the awareness. So thank you again for a great talk and wish you a great rest of the day.
Thank you, same. And if you have any other questions, you can write me on Twitter or anything. So I'll be answering.
Definitely, everybody do that.
Thank you.